Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. All right. Yeah. Here we go.
So when we look at the Gospel of John tells us certain things that help us to imagine what the situation must have been like at that time. So we've talked about the Johannine school, how it is that the Gospel of John, the first, second, and third letters of John, and the book of Revelation are all attributed to this Johannine school. They're all attributed to John. How it is that they all must have been written by persons, like-minded persons. So what it is that we can tell from these 5 books, the Gospel of John, 1, 2, and 3 John, and the book of Revelation, what can we tell about the world in which those people were living just by reading those works? So this is a possible history of the Johannine community. And it's important for us to say a possible history because unless anyone here in this room was living then, at that place, at that time, then we're just trying to reconstruct what it would have been like. We're going to say that all this is hypothetical, and we'd have to preface each sentence by saying, perhaps this is the way that it was. So we're going to divide this into 4 different phases. Essentially, before the gospel was written, while it was written, the time it was being redacted, and the time, how it is that we can break this into different phases and see what it is that we can learn about each phase of the history of the Johannine community. So we start with phase 1. During the 70s and 80s, we say that the gospel was written roughly in the 90s. Then the first phase then is going to be leading up to that. In the 70s and 80s, is there anything that we can know about that first phase when from the time that Jesus died, around 30 AD, the stories were circulating up until 90 when they were written down. What can we tell about this time before the Gospel of John was written? So we're imagining that Jews in or near Palestine, that various Jews, accepted Jesus as the Davidic Messiah. Going back to our course in Christology, there were Jews who were looking for a Messiah who would come in the line of David, and there were certain people who looked at Jesus and said, oh my God, that's him. That's the Davidic Messiah that we've been waiting for. So certain Jews believed that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, including John the Baptist, if we're to believe the Gospels, where John points to him and says, this is the Lamb of God. So various people thought that Jesus was the Messiah, the one who was going to fulfill various prophecies, and they knew that because of the various miracles that he worked. It was a way of confirming that he spoke with God's power and that he had God's power. So it's before the Gospel of John was written, we presume that there were Jews who thought this about Jesus, that Jesus was the Messiah. Among those Jews, it may be the case that one of those Jews would later become known as the beloved disciple. If the Gospel of John is written by the beloved disciple, then maybe one of those Jews at that time who believed in Jesus, maybe that person was around in that time who would later become the beloved disciple. To these first followers were added other Jews who had an anti-temple bias and who made converts in Samaria and who had a Mosaic bias and who believed that Jesus had been with God and came down to this world. Whoa, that was a lot. Let's try to unpack that slowly here. So, we have this group of people who believe that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah. That's one group of people. Now what happens when another group of people join them? They come with their own ideas. What are some of the ideas that they're bringing now to this group that believed that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah? 4 principal things that they had in common. One, that they had an anti-temple bias. By this time, the temple is destroyed. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. The temple that was standing is now destroyed. And so this is a group of people who seem to have a bias against the temple and all that went around there. Things like the selling of animals. Right? Have you heard any stories of Jesus going in and throwing over the tables of money changers? That's probably someone who didn't like what was going on in the temple. Follow me? So they probably had an anti-temple bias. Another feature of this group, they likely made converts in Samaria Why would we say that? Because John chapter 4 is all about the Samaritan woman. So there's some acquaintance with Samaria and or some relationship. Why would there be a story about a Samaritan woman unless we're preaching with and interacting with Samaritans? So there may be some connection to Samaria in all of this. They also, the second group who's coming in, had a Mosaic bias. Okay, so think about the differences. It's one thing to believe in a Davidic Messiah. That's just someone who's being, the heritage is being passed down from David's throne now to the Davidic Messiah. The Mosaic bias is slightly different. In the Old Testament, what did Moses do? He went up the mountain and he brought down the law. This is very different. So rather than looking at this line of David resulting in this new Messiah, we go from David the king now to this Messiah, the Christ that we're waiting for. Wait a minute, this is very different. They have this story of Moses, looking back to Moses, not David, looking back to Moses, going up the mountain and meeting God and coming down. Ooh, John is a high Christology. Do you see where we might be going here? Of God coming down. What's the fourth element that they believe? That they believed that Jesus had been with God and did what? Came down to this world. How does John chapter 1 begin? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was where? With God. And the Word was who? The Word was God. And what happens in verse 14? The Word becomes flesh. Whoa! So imagine, for instance, this conflict of two people coming together, two groups of people who have two very different ideas. One group is simply saying, we believe that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, that David had this line that is now being continued in Jesus. That's all this one group is saying. This other group now is coming in, having these other biases, friends, about how it is that Moses came down with the law, and how it is that the Word, God spoke the Word, and the Word becomes flesh in Jesus. Those are two different kinds of thoughts. How are we going to fit them together? Do they fit together? So the acceptance of this second group catalyzed the high pre-existence Christology. So imagine, for instance, the first group who just believed that Jesus was the Davidic Messiah, that was one thing. That was what we believed. But now when this other group comes into us with this thing of Jesus coming down, what's going to happen? Certainly we're going to have this shift to a high pre-existence Christology. What does it mean to have a high Christology? In a high Christology, is Jesus God or is Jesus human? High Christology? Jesus is God. Whoa. The Word is with God and the Word is God. That's a high Christology. And a pre-existence theology, what does that mean? That Christ pre-existed. That Christ was in the beginning. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was what? The Word. Jesus knew that he existed before he was born. Whoa. So we have this second group coming in, and that led to various debates as to whether these Jews were now still monotheists or not. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, help me to understand this. This is God in our picture here. This is God speaking the Word. So now the Word is separate from God, but you're telling me that the Word is God? This is God, but now God speaks the Word, and the Word is God. So this is God too? How many gods do you believe in? I'm not understanding how you get one. Put them together. That makes two. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly my point. Follow me? So the challenge was for them to simply wrap their minds around it and think, wait a minute, are we still Jews? Are we still monotheists? Or do we now believe in two gods? Because we believe in Yahweh, this God, who spoke the Word, but we're saying that the Word now is God as well. 1 plus 1 equals 1. Mario, you're smarter than that. 1 plus 1 equals 1. No.
2 legs, we can have 2.
So that was the question. That was the question for the early Jews. There you go. The question for the early Jews was, does 1 plus 1 equal 1, or does 1 plus 1 equal 2? Because if 1 plus 1 equals 2, God is God, God the Father is God, and Jesus is God, and that equals 2, then you're no longer a monotheist. You're a bitheist. You believe in two gods. If we want to be monotheists, we have to believe in one God, which means that 1 and 1 have to equal 1. 1 plus 1 equals 1. God the Father, God the Son, 1 plus 1 equals 1.
But if the Jews believed in the Messiah, did they not consider the Messiah anything short of God?
Excellent question. So with the Messiah, this political Davidic Messiah was simply coming in to initiate the reign of God. Was the Messiah God? Not in the same sense.
Mm-hmm.
We remember that God is going to be all in the end of time. And so here as we're going toward the future, God is breaking in proleptically, and that's what's happening when the Messiah comes. We see God breaking in and creating all these miracles through the Messiah. That doesn't mean the Messiah is God. God is breaking in through the Messiah. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, what's happening? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. 1 plus 1 equals 2. Are you telling me something different?
If God can do everything, He could do that.
If God can make a round square,
So,
if God can make a square circle, then yes, God can do that, right?
Wait
a minute, a square circle? Do you believe that God can do the impossible? Right? And she used that example. This is a square. A square means it has 4 sides, which are all the same length, and they're at 90 degrees from one another. A circle means that every point is equidistant from a point that's in the center. Can you have a square circle? It seems that the answer would be no. But can God work the impossible? If so, that means that there's a square circle somewhere. Jews are monotheists. For them, there's no problem, because for them, there's only one God, you Christian heretics. For Jews, there's no problem, because there is one God. We believe in one God. For those who believe that Jesus is God, 1 plus 1 equals what? So now we have this debate in the early community of wondering, okay, now what's going on here? Are we still Jews? We used to be monotheists. Are we still monotheists? Do we still believe in one God, or are we now believing in 2 gods? Because now that we're saying that the Word was with God and the Word was God, that's creating some challenges for us. Other Jews had these Johannine Christians expelled from the synagogues. Why? Because these other Jews no longer believed what we believed. We talked about this many times before, right? Suddenly, if you have a group, and we're all waiting for the Messiah, but then suddenly Mario comes in and is saying, I have great news for you. The Messiah came. This crucified criminal that we had, that was the Messiah. Okay, we have a decision to make here. Do we accept Mario and believe whatever it is that he's saying about a crucified criminal being the Messiah? Mario, do you hear yourself? Crucified criminal Messiah? Do we believe what he says? Or do we eventually just get tired of him and say, we love you, Mario, but why don't you just not come to these classes anymore, because you believe something that we don't believe? Right? So those Christians, the early Christians, were expelled from the synagogue. Because even though we loved them, they no longer believed. We're still waiting for the Messiah. They're trying to tell us that the Messiah came in the form of a crucified criminal, a carpenter of all things. And so the Christians were expelled from the synagogues. How is the story going to develop? We believe that these Johannine Christians turned hostile toward the Jews. The expression in the scripture is always the Jews, as if all Jews are all the same, and we lump them all together, right? So we talk about the Jews who expelled us from their synagogues, right? So there's this hostile view in the scriptures of the Jews and how it is that the Jews killed Jesus, okay? It's almost like we're blaming them. It's like we're still mad. We're still hurting about the fact that they expelled us. Here we are, we're just trying to be nice and tell them the Messiah has come, and they expel us and start mistreating us, and we're handed over to the emperor and made set on fire and fed to the lions and all that. Wait a minute. Now how it is that the Jews killed Jesus? We're becoming hostile to the Jews, whom the Christians regarded as children of the devil, who. Now we get into name calling. If we were to open our Bibles to John chapter 8, where Jesus says, you belong to your father, the devil, and you willingly carry out your father's desires, the desires of the devil. Whoa! Does this give us some insight into what's going on? The question is, did the historical Jesus really say that and believe that? Or did these Christians at the time of John, they were putting words on Jesus' mouth, talking about how it is that the Jews were now the son of the devil. Did the historical Jesus really say that? Most scholars would probably attribute that to the author saying that Jesus said it. Johannine Christians despised believers in Jesus who didn't make the same public break from the synagogue. So how interesting that some of them were expelled because Mario, as much as we loved him, we expelled him. But then there were other people like Becky, who even though she believed in that Christ had come, she just loved us so much that she kept coming back to the synagogue, and she wasn't as vocal as Mario. And so long as you don't speak up, Becky, sure, come and join us. Right? Yeah, bring the cookies, come join us. Imagine what we do without Becky. So now what does that do for Becky's relationship to Mario and Mario's relationship to Becky? They both believe that Jesus came and was the Messiah. Mario's the one who's been expelled now. He sees that Becky's back with them. What accusation does Mario start making against Becky? Yeah. Right? That Becky's selling herself out or somehow not being faithful. But we've got to make a break from this group. All the people in that room, in that synagogue, you just got to make a break from them. Becky, bring your cookies. Right? Go elsewhere. Right? You can go elsewhere. So Johannine Christians despised the believers who wouldn't make the public break from the synagogue. And we see that in certain things. For instance, in chapter 9, verses 21 to 23, when they go to the man who is born blind, they go to his parents. His parents say, we do not know how he sees now, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He can speak for himself. Why did his parents say that? Verse 22. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, that person would be expelled from the synagogue. You follow me? Now, was all this happening back in the time of Jesus, of people being expelled from the synagogue? Or was this what was happening during John's time? That's what we're led to believe. That these are events that were happening in John's time of people being expelled from the synagogue, and people like Mario being expelled saying, wait a minute, taking a look at how it is that people were afraid of being expelled. Poor Becky, she kept going back to the synagogue because she was afraid of being expelled. And Mario was saying, heck, come and join me. It's not so bad. Right? I don't think I'm going to hell. I believe in Jesus. And then finally in this phase, we believe that the disciple that we mentioned above, who would later become the beloved disciple, that somehow this person who would later become the beloved disciple made this break from the synagogue, so maybe Mario is the beloved disciple. This person who made the break from the synagogue tried to help others to make that break. Becky, come on, we'll help you through this. Thus becoming the beloved disciple and the one that we all looked to as sort of like the model and the example in this community. The great hero, Mario, in our community. Phase 1, in what we might assume or guess or hypothesize about this community,